Good afternoon. I'm David Haynes. I'm the editorial page editor at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. We're joined today by Senate candidate Eric Hovde. Mr. Hovde, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
So let's get right to it. You've taken in recent days a few knocks from conservatives who say that in some ways they don't think you're conservative enough. I want to quote here from the Club for Growth president, Chris Chocolate, who said, just who's worse is admittedly a close call for us. He's talking about you and Tommy Thompson. Tommy raised taxes repeatedly. On the other hand, Eric Hovde has called for higher taxes and supported Jim Doyle. So the question is, what can you say to reassure fiscal conservatives in this primary that you're not really a taxer and spender in disguise?
Look, when you get in a race, the one thing you don't want to be is irrelevant. Once you become relevant and once you take the lead position or near lead position, depending on the poll, you're going to get a whole host of different attacks. The attacks by the club are ridiculous at every single level. The club is tied into Mark because the number of people at the club work for Mark Newman, work for Mark, both as his chief of staff and then one of them worked for his home building company. As it pertains to the tax issue, it's real simple. During the 2008 or 2009 timeframe, they take a quote from a time when I guest hosted CNBC Squawk Box. And we're in the heart of the financial crisis, and I can't remember how the question was asked, but to deal with our deficit problem, would you be willing to pay more tax? And my comment was, I've been blessed in life and fortunate. I would be willing, not raising tax rates against raising tax rates for a whole set of issues. In fact, I'm probably the only Senate candidate ever in the history of running that's done an ad about we need to reduce corporate tax rates. And what I was largely referring to is one of my businesses benefits from the carried interest, my asset management business. To me, it's just another form of distortions in our tax code. I believe we need to lower our tax rates, get rid of all the corporate welfare, and fair up the system. I don't believe that we should have a tax code where certain parties benefit because they have connections to Washington, and other parties are paying the lion's share of the tax burden. So I believe we get rid of all the corporate welfare. So they take one little quote where I'm talking about myself personally, referring to, I know what I'm talking about because it was a discussion point at great length at that point in time, still is. It was asked today of Timothy Geithner when he was doing his presentation at the Alpha Conference in New York City, and he was asked specifically about the carried interest. And so because I refer to that, you get hit with this ridiculous attack. It's just part of politics.
Okay. On the carried interest issue, what would you do with that? Would you eliminate that break?
Yeah, what I would do is, and I've said this and I've been very clear, I would get rid of all corporate loopholes, every single one of them. It doesn't matter.
With an eye toward lowering rates?
With an eye toward lowering rates. The reason why we have not had meaningful reform of our corporate tax system since Reagan did it in '86 is because big business kills it at every turn. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world at 35%, higher than any country anywhere around the globe. At the same time, you have the S&P 500 companies that tend to pay about half the normal rate, 16 to 17% any given year. You have certain companies, I can just name a few. General Electric have 1,000 people in their tax department. There are years that General Electric will pay nothing in tax. In fact, the New York Times did a whole front page article on this issue. Goldman Sachs has 84 offshore corporations. There are times that Goldman Sachs pays nothing in tax. Apple Computer came out, pays 9% in tax. So what you're doing is you're distorting our whole economic system. And what you're doing is making it exceptionally difficult for small businesses to grow and prosper. And by the way, it is our small business and medium-sized businesses that create jobs in our country. large businesses, as they drive towards efficiency, tend to fire as many people as they hire. It is small businesses that grow our economy. So how is a small business that's paying a 35% corporate tax rate going to compete with a company that's paying half that rate, or in some cases, no tax at all? So think of it. If you're a small manufacturer competing with the division of GE, and they're paying nothing in tax and you're paying 35%, or a small technology company competing against Apple that's paying, I think last year Apple paid 9% in tax versus 35%, you're at immediate massive competitive disadvantage. Plus these big companies have better access to the capital markets to begin with, so can access debt and equity cheaper. So at every single level, it is distorting our free market system. So I'm a strong believer you got to push down tax rates, you have to simplify our code. It is estimated right now that we spend as Americans anywhere from $160 to $300 billion a year in tax preparation. It's absurdity. That's anywhere from 1 to almost 2% of our GDP. So I think we need a massive overhaul of our tax system. I think we have to simplify the individual brackets. I think we have 6 individual brackets right now. I think those should be simplified down to 2. I think we need to broaden the base on taxation. And get rid of most of the loopholes. Now, on an individual basis, there are certain things that I'm supportive of. And in that interview, by the way, that they quote about CNBC, I mocked the idea that President Obama was pushing at that point and taking away the charitable tax deduction. That was, and that may have how it all came out. I have to go back and even rewatch that CNBC clip. But where they were floating the idea of taking that away, which to me is the last thing I would ever take away, because we know charities do a vastly better job of caring for those people that are economically struggling than government ever does. So there's a couple things that I wouldn't touch, but in large part I'm a believer that you get rid of all the corporate welfare loopholes and even most of the individual loopholes.
Okay. Lee Berquist, reporter for the Journal Sentinel.
This afternoon, after the luncheon meeting with reporters, you said that there are issues on finance and the economy that, frankly, Tommy Thompson would have a hard time understanding. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that. And if I could just add, isn't a statement like that fairly patronizing for someone who was the governor of the state for 14 years, health secretary for 4 years, and spent 5 years on corporate boards and running companies?
Sure. What I was talking about specifically was our global capital markets. The problem that we have today is so many of the issues have become so overly opaque, complicated, and it has driven issues from, and they come out of the global capital markets, be it Wall Street or the globe as a whole. And if you look at it, if you go to the root cause of something like the internet bubble, or you go to the housing bubble, or you go to the brief commodity bubble that we had after at the end of the housing bubble, or now the government spending bubble, so many of these issues, people in Washington have no clue what they're talking about. I'll give you a prime example of it. And by the way, Lee, I don't think Governor Thompson could sit here and talk about these issues. All right? I'm going to be very clear. I'm not going to back down on what I've said. I will, and in fact, I'd be glad to have him sit in any room and talk about things like the credit default swap market. Talk about the CDO's structure. Now, people may say, oh, what's the big thing about that? The credit default swap market was a $54 trillion notional value market. It is the single biggest reason why we put $187 billion into AIG. We're buying out counterparty contracts from Goldman Sachs, SocGen, companies all over the world at 100 cents on the dollar when those contracts were trading at 30 to 40 cents on the dollar. People don't understand that the bailout that I've been against, they all think it's TARP. TARP was a small fraction of the bailouts that occurred. I could run through a whole litany of programs, the TSLF, the TGLP, the PPIP, on and on and on. Backdoor mechanism that the Federal Reserve and that the Treasury used to prop up the financial system. Now, I have a big problem with that because they're doing it in an opaque manner. And secondly, there's no consequences for the executives of those firms. So, we can take the housing bubble and the issues that occurred during that. We can go back to the internet bubble. For me, who's spent my life in the global financial markets, I could see what was happening in the internet bubble. I could see how they threw away their underwriting guidebooks of having to have a company be in formation for more than 5 years. You see, back in the Great Depression, one of the causes of the Great Depression was the fact that they were taking companies public that really were shells, were jokes. They were selling stocks, and it was a huge fraud on the American public. People were buying stock in some company that there was really no viability to. So after the Great Depression, what happened is an underwriting guidebook got put in place for Wall Street, and certain conditions had to be met for these companies, for the investment banking community to take these companies public. Unfortunately, during the height of the internet bubble, all these sins came back in place. So they threw away their underwriting guidebook. So no longer did a company have to be in existence for 5 years. No longer did it have to be profitable for 3 years. And I could just go on with the litany of things. Because what they were doing was they were not only making a killing on taking the company private, but what they were doing is injecting capital into the company shortly before they took it public, and running up the valuation and laying it off on a bunch of unsophisticated investors. So yes, I don't believe, because I've experienced it firsthand, that most career politicians have a clear understanding of what's driving so many of our economic problems. And I would include Governor Thompson in that equation. And I would love for Governor Thompson to meet me, sit down, any place, anytime, and have this debate with all of you around us.
Just a follow-up.
And it's not, and Lee, it's not mean to be demeaning in one iota to Governor Thompson. I respect him as an individual. I respect what he's done. But, it is time, instead of having speeches of what I did 20 years ago, and to come out or saying I'm the one who's leading the polls, and come and talk what he plans to do for the country. The U.S. Senate seat is not an entitlement.
Do you think the other two candidates could do it?
What's that?
Do you think the other two candidates could discuss those issues?
I don't know.
Go back a minute to September 2008 when all this is happening. And from the knowledge you have, what should have been done different? I mean, you had a period in September of 2008, I believe it was September, you have Paulson and people thinking the whole economic system's going to collapse. How would you have set things going forward to be different and protect it from happening again?
Let me jump in. Marty Kaiser, editor of the paper.
Marty, great question. The problem is it would take me 2 hours to go through it, but let's take little pieces of it.
Sure, I appreciate that.
First of all, if we felt, and there was risk of it, that the whole financial system was going to collapse, then if they were going to provide the type of support and stimulus, be it through TARP or these other programs, the cost of capital input should have been at a vastly higher rate than what they did. And I'd have to go back and show you how cheap the access to capital, the 6% return that the investment banking or the big banks got on TARP money, when the yields, if you were floating that kind of paper at that time, would have easily been double. The warrant coverage of only 15% warrant coverage on the company, and then they used a strike price at a vastly higher price than where the stock was trading at. So you have that issue as a whole. The second issue, and probably the more relevant one, was the fact that the executives themselves were never replaced from their positions. Let's go over for 2 seconds to Europe. When Sweden's banking system failed 20 some odd years ago, and they had to step in and provide the support so the whole system didn't collapse, they removed every CEO of every one of those banks and many of the board members. And the equity returns to the government on providing that capital was much like what you as a private investor would charge. We didn't do that. I mean, you have executive after executive that was, retained in those positions.
How do you make that happen, though? I mean,
no, it's real simple. If you need our capital, you're gone. Look at what just happened. Look at what just happened with Barclays.
Yep.
The issue over LIBOR. Bob Diamond was replaced. And frankly, his fingerprints weren't even on the manipulation of LIBOR. So, but, the Bank of England said, no, he's gone, or you're going to have regulatory issues. Now, I wouldn't take that punitive approach, but it's real simple. If you need our capital to survive, then we expect change at the management structure. So that's just one component piece of it. Let's move to the housing market. One of the most disastrous policies that President Obama did was with the housing market when he came in and said, we are going to try to do principal reduction for those people that have stopped paying on their mortgages, that have defaulted on their mortgage. It sounds good. It sounds nice. Let's help those people who are struggling. Well, here's the fundamental byproduct of it. Your neighbor A, your neighbor B. You've stopped paying on your mortgage. Now, a year and a half goes by, you're still in your home because they've put up restrictions against foreclosure. You're struggling to pay on your mortgage. Now, all of a sudden, President Obama says, we're going to try to reduce your principal. You look at that and go, man, I must be the fool. I'm paying, I'm struggling, I'm working to honor my obligation. My neighbor hasn't paid in a year and a half. He's still in his home, and now he's going to get principal reduction. What was the byproduct of that? He strategically defaulted, as did the neighbor across the street, as the neighbor across the street. I had these discussions with the FDIC, the heads of the FDIC. I said, this is not going to work. You are going to create more strategic defaulters. It got to the point where a bank that I own in California, Community Bank, I asked to my board of directors that were sitting around the table, I said, can any of you, or do any of you know somebody that is strategically defaulting right now? Now, you have to understand, a board of bank directors, this is I have a gentleman that runs the largest independent accounting firm in Orange County, a gentleman that ran a big hospital. I mean, these are people at the higher end of the business community. Every single person raised their hand, including myself, because I had two people, not people I knew well, but called me, one of my brother's ex-girlfriends, saying, hey, I bought this house at the peak of the market, and I want to find a way just to stop paying and get a principal reduction. I said, well, do you have the money to pay for it? And she says, yeah. And I said, well, you're calling me, a person who owns community banking, and asking how to default on your mortgage. I'm not going to walk you through that. So they caused a massive wave of strategic defaulters. Now, it took them 3.5 years later to figure out, it was a giant mistake. And by the way, now let's focus on what they should have done from the get-go, and that is how to help those people that are actually paying on their mortgage, that have been struggling to try to honor their contract, and let's get them refinanced into a lower rate. So you've got the housing piece, you have how you deal with the executives. I'll give you another one, the credit default swap market. Again, the issue that we just got speaking about. Do all of you know what a credit default swap is? I have no problem. Don't worry if you don't, because it's a very complicated instrument. A credit default swap, first of all, a derivative derives its value off of a financial contract. That's why it's called a derivative. It's part of the overall derivatives. A credit default swap is essentially an insurance contract, where if I own the bonds of a government or of a company, that I can buy insurance that in the event that this company defaults, that somebody's going to pay me out. The problem with the credit default swap market, it's grown vastly bigger than the amount of bonds underneath it. So it's become a massive gambling casino for Wall Street, because you have notional value that's far bigger than the underlying face value of those bonds. Now, Dodd-Frank was created. They write all these regulations, which, frankly, most of it makes no sense, when it would have been real simple to deal with the credit default swap market in a much more efficient manner. And that is, say, just like stocks, back to pre the Great Depression, a lot of stocks were not traded over an exchange. They were traded over the counter where nobody knew what the pricing was, didn't have any information. If you would have forced every CDS contract within 2 years to be traded over an exchange, and for the party that was providing the insurance to have collateral or to have cash collateral, and the party that was buying the insurance had to own the underlying bond. I could write that in 2 pages. Guess what would have happened? Whop! You would have just shrinking massively. Now, Wall Street doesn't want it.
Would your party have gone along with you? Think you could have got Republicans to go along with you?
It would have been hard. It would have been very hard. In fact, I'll take you back to, again, to my comments about politicians. Because they don't operate in these markets and they don't understand what they're doing. And I'm not going to name names, you can figure it out. In the height of the crisis, I went up trying to meet with senators and congressmen to explain the severity of what was going on pre the bubble popping and once it had popped. And I was in a meeting with the Senate banking minority leader, Republican, and in a Q&A, and I asked, Senator, what are you going to do about the credit default swap market? Well, you could see the wheels started moving slowly. And then he gives me an answer, well, dealing with problem and toxic loans, getting them off the bank's balance sheets are very difficult. And I said, excuse me, Senator, I'm not talking about toxic loans. I'm talking about credit default swaps that have a $54 trillion notional value, which is the reason we put $187 billion into AIG. Now, people forget, that bailout was bigger than all the other bailouts. There's no company that required that big a bailout. That was the biggest one. And he had no answer. Now, my response to that is, look, I understand that for vast majority of Americans, they shouldn't have to know what a credit default swap is. Frankly, I don't think most politicians will know what a credit default swap is, and that's understandable. But when you are the Senate banking minority leader and you've just gone through a financial crisis and the credit default swap market is known as the ticking time bomb that can blow up the whole global financial system, and you just got finished putting $187 billion into a single company, don't you think somebody would have had the good sense to say, why are we doing this? So, it was that experience and many others where I'd walk out of meetings and just shake my head and say, how the heck are we ever going to turn our country around? And again, Lee, back to the point, if you've never operated extensively in the private sector, you're not going to have the knowledge to understand a lot of the issues that are driving our economy today. And these are huge issues.
But in that case, Tommy Thompson has been in the private sector, by his description for the last 5 years or so, serving on corporate boards and managing a lacrosse company, at least as he says. So, doesn't he have some private sector experience?
Yes, he does. But I can tell you a board of director is a vastly different role than somebody who operates, look, board members play a critical and important role. There's no question about that. But just going on a whole variety of corporate boards, first of all, I don't believe any individual should serve on more than 3 or 4 corporate boards at any point in time because you can't do your job appropriately. I think Tommy was on, I don't even know how many, to be honest with you. And secondly, as we've come to know far too often, too many corporate board members do not roll up their sleeves and really get to know the underlying business. And at the same time, Tommy is of counsel to Aiken Gump, and he's a lobbyist. Mm-hmm. And I have yet to meet many lobbyists that really understand the issues that are driving the business community.
Lee, you had another question?
Ask another question.
Yeah.
There's been, Tammy Baldwin released her taxes, 10 years worth of taxes.
Yep.
Democrats today, Democratic Party called on both you and Thompson and Fitzgerald and Newman to release your taxes. I believe you may have said that you were planning to do so.
I'm going to release my taxes in the next couple of weeks. You have to understand, when you have a variety of different business interests, I have to wait until the K-1s get reported. K-1 is the tax form that comes out on the business to show what my tax obligation is from that business. So I can't just wave my hands, a magic wand, and say, all of you bring your K-1s to me at this point in time. So it takes time. I think that we're going to probably have them done within the next 2 weeks.
How far back are you gonna go?
2 years.
2 years?
Yeah.
Now, Tammy went back 10 years. Is there a...
Lee, all she's been in government her whole life, it's very easy to report her tax returns for 10 years. I'm going to do 2 years, and that's all I'm going to do. And it's going to show everything. I just got finished doing my whole financial my financial statements. But yeah, if all you're doing is collecting a government paycheck and your tax return's very simple, then it's easy to go back 10 years.
Your campaign in April told me that you would be releasing them in a couple of weeks, and explained later in April that it would be a couple more weeks. And now you're saying today it'll be a couple more weeks. Why should we have confidence that you're going to release them in 2 weeks when your campaign for 4 months has been saying that they'll be out soon?
First of all, I think what we may have been talking about may not have been tax returns. It was the financial report, the personal financial statement.
Right.
And I have reported that, as you know. Secondly, once I got to see how complicated that was, I had people working overtime for a month on it. I'm sure you've seen a few hundred different line items. I never in my wildest imaginations could imagine that the government could come up with something so arcane that literally every fund that I have an investment in, you have to take every holding of that fund, splicing it down, even if the amount of its holding to your net worth is such a fraction it's immaterial. So, Dan, in a couple weeks, if you don't see my tax returns, knock on my door. I'll be more than happy to, take your hard question at that point.
Marty?
Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm Ernie Frost, the Associate Editorial Page Editor. You've talked about your willingness to repeal the Affordable Care Act. What parts of it do you like? Is it all bad? And what would you put in its place?
I'd repeal it in its entirety. Let me back up and then we'll move forward. The two highest rates of inflation the two sectors with the highest rates of inflation over the last 30 years in the private sector have been higher education and healthcare. What is the similarity between them? Ever increasing government involvement in those two programs. 60 cents on every dollar spent today now in healthcare comes from the federal and state government. Furthermore, when President Obama passed Obamacare, he said that it will save taxpayer money over the next decade. The way they arrived at that was factoring in 10 years worth of tax revenue, but only 6.5 years worth of expenses. That is fraud. If a public company CEO engaged and did their books that way, they would be put in jail. And I'm shocked, frankly, that the press hasn't held them accountable for that. So it's going to create an economic weight. And my last point, we have yet to see Washington, D.C. manage anything well. I don't know how they're going to manage the second largest sector in our economy that will, in the next probably 5 to 8 years, become the largest sector in our economy. I think we need to move back to a free market approach to solve a lot of these problems. I think we need to break up the mini monopolies in every single state where one or two health insurers provide insurance contracts or insurance. I think we need to move to a free market approach to have people start to become smart consumers, shoppers, just like they do for buying an automobile, buying a home, buying their food, buying any other necessity in life, and just like they did for the first 200 and some odd years in our country's history. So I think we need to deal with moving and having people take personal responsibility of their health and buying their health insurance or health services. Now let's deal with the complicated part of the problem. Outside of fraud, which is systemic in our healthcare industry, I'm sure your paper has written about it. In fact, I remember the Washington Post reading back in 2006 or 2007, they did a GAO study, or GAO did a study on home health care, and home health care is where a nurse has to come to your home to provide service. They found that 68% of the $100 billion spent was fraud. We know we have massive fraud at every single level. I mean, Florida's right now trying to deal with the pill clinics down in Florida and places like Kentucky, where it's just all Medicare and Medicaid fraud and just, pill dispensaries. A lot of it narcotics. But putting that fraud piece aside, which is critical, the two biggest cost drivers are end-of-life care and chronic disease. Could be Parkinson's, could be cancer, could be Alzheimer's, could be MS, could be any one of those things. Or it could be as simple as, sadly, you're driving home tonight and the car hits you and you sever your spinal cord. That, in my view, is a catastrophic event. I think in those instances, I think the government can play a role, and a very critical role. And that is providing premium support to those people that don't have the economic means to buy insurance for those catastrophic events in life. Outside of that, I think it's up to people to start taking responsibility for their own health and their own health needs and making them think as a smart shopper. I've had two cases just on this RV trip that I did, where I've had stories where people came up and one gentleman said, and I may get the numbers wrong just because I'm overly tired, but I'll be in the approximate range. He said, I've suffered from some medical issues. I went to the doctor. I needed a minor surgery. And the doctor told me it was going to be somewhere around $15,000. And he said, doctor, I don't have that money. And the doctor said, well, don't you have insurance? He said, well, I've lost my insurance. He said, well, Medicaid. He said, I'm making enough. I'm just over the poverty line, so I don't have Medicaid. The doctor's response is, instead of going to the hospital, come to my office 2 days from now, and I'll do it for $1,500. I told that story in Eagle River. When I'm walking out, a man came up to me and said, sir, let me tell you my story. I have cancer. I needed to get a PET scan done. Now, fortunately, I do qualify for Medicaid. But this PET scan, when they told me how much it would cost, was going to be $11,800. And I thought, God, that is awfully high. So he said, I wanted to test it. I came back 2 days later, or a day later, I can't remember exactly, and he said, I don't have Medicaid, I need this test. How much would it cost? They charged him $1,800. So our medical system is so broken on so many different levels. I saw it with my elderly mother before she passed away. I saw it, and it's not something that we want to talk about on camera and all the rest, but basically she had a little blood coming out of an area of her body, and they wanted to give her a colonoscopy. Mm-hmm. Okay, now you have to understand, my mother is an 81-year-old woman. And I heard this, I almost went ballistic. I said, what do you mean they want to give her a colonoscopy? Because my older brother's neighbor's mother just had died from a colonoscopy at an elderly age because they punctured the lining. And as you know, colonoscopies can be a high-risk event, particularly for older people, because your systems become more brittle. So I got the doctor on the line, and I said, Doctor, you're advising to have a colonoscopy. I'd like to understand why. Well, there's a little blood. And I said, okay, well, what are you worried about? Well, it could be cancer. I said, what's the risk of cancer? Well, extremely small. How small? Less than a couple percent. Okay. If even it is cancer, she's 81 years old, do you think she would ever die from that cancer? No. At that age, the cancer would move so slowly, she would probably never die from it. So then I hit him with the big question. Then why are you advising my 81-year-old mother to do a procedure that is more risky than even if she had cancer and you've already said that she probably doesn't have it? Our whole medical system is broken.
Now, a couple of pieces, though, of the CARE Act are pretty popular with voters. The no pre-existing conditions and keeping your kids under your insurance until 26.
The pre-existing conditions, I understand, and it goes to a deeper issue as far as I'm concerned and how insurance is written. You have to understand, in every other aspects of our lives, we buy insurance individually. Think of it. You buy your homeowner insurance individually. You buy your car insurance individually. Everything else in life you buy individually. What happened is Health insurance came as a byproduct of World War II, where they couldn't increase wages, so the way for businesses to attract employees was offering them health insurance, and their tax code got morphed. I think we've got to get back to where people are able to buy, and again, break up these mini monopolies, because it's absurd. I mean, the banking system, if you go back 30 years ago, a bank from Wisconsin couldn't go into Minnesota and vice versa, or couldn't go into Illinois and vice versa, and then we saw the interstate banking laws crumble, and you brought in competition. The same thing should happen with insurance.
You've talked about being able to buy across state lines.
Absolutely.
But
But
now,
you talked earlier about the premium, the person getting hit by a car. What if these people don't buy insurance? Were you just going to turn them away when they show up at the emergency room?
No, and that's the reality of it. They are going to suffer some level of consequence. But again, if you are economically disadvantaged and don't have the means to buy that catastrophic insurance, that is a way where the government can provide premium support, where they can access a government check to buy that comprehensive insurance for the event of a catastrophe.
And if they don't, then we're just
You
going
know
to take
what?
care of them anyway.
Well, guess what? That's been happening.
Eric, James calls the editorial.
But you were asking, I was addressing one point, and I don't know if
Yeah,
I...
one was the pre-existing conditions, the other was the keeping your kids until they're 26.
Yeah, the pre-existing conditions, because if we can get back to individual insurance, then you can carry your insurance anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have that event, because that's one of the big problems. Most people, as we know, it's fairly rare, unless you're a young child and get hit with a childhood disease. Most disease onset tends to come in your 30, at the earliest in your 30s, but more cases, your 40s, 50s, or 60s. So if you could buy and have portable insurance, then you don't even have that issue. As it pertains to allowing kids up to 26, I understand it, but I also am concerned that we continue to extend, how do you say this? You continue to extend a variation of childhood far too long. At 21 years old, my parents had, one child, another child on their way. They were standing on their own 2 feet. Look, all your parents were that way. You go back to our grandparents, you're on your 2 feet even earlier in life. And, one of the big problems that you're seeing in Europe, kids never get out of that stage of growing up and maturing, and they've names in Italy, the Bambinos, and in Spain, and all the rest. So to some degree, I do have a little bit of an issue that come age 21, you should start taking responsibility for your own life. Now, if you had a condition, as a childhood disease, then of course you should be able to carry that. There's no question about that.
One other question on healthcare, and we'll move on to something
Sure.
else. But you favored, as we mentioned, being able to buy insurance across state lines. So I could buy insurance from an Ohio company if I wanted to.
Absolutely.
But the critics of that idea say that one of the issues is the varying regulation from state to state, and you could run the risk of a race to the bottom in regulation. Is that a concern? And if it is, how would you deal with it? In other words, you might shop.
No, I understand exactly what you're talking about, because, look, if you go back, you had, I'll take you back again, 30 plus years before the interstate banking laws, the level of regulation for state chartered banks in places like Ohio or Maryland were not as comprehensive as what you had at the federal level, so you did have some of those problems. But my response to that is, one, the insurance industry at times has talked about moving to a federal regulator. I don't know if that's necessarily the route you have to go, because I think states can do a lot of things very effectively. But yes, there's never going to be a perfect solution, and there may be some negative byproduct of that. But the fact that you're going to drive costs down and you're going to open up the free market system to competitively price health insurance is a huge windfall for consumers.
James.
Yeah, let's stick on insurance for a moment. In Milwaukee County alone, there are about 100,000 people who don't have insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And statewide, there's about over 400,000 people without insurance. And, I know you talk about responsibility being a factor, but you have to factor in poverty as being one of the reasons too.
Of course.
It makes absolutely no sense that people have to rely on free clinics to take care of their healthcare needs. I mean, what would you say to someone like in a condition like that? Do you just turn them away when they...
No, I've talked about, again, premium support for those significant events, but we also have to have people stand on their own 2 feet and start focusing on their health. We have an obesity crisis. We've taken away people's self-responsibility to try to take care of their own health. Look, the more we've moved to a socialized system of medicine, we've seen the quality of our health in this country decline. That's a fact. That's just a plain fact. Type 2 diabetes has skyrocketed. You know, we have to start making people take personal responsibility. If you always, we're just going to take care of everything for you, then you lose your sense of personal responsibility in that process. And I am a huge believer in that. Because as I said in the speech that I just gave, you know, and it's going a little off topic, so I hope you oblige me for 2 seconds. But I asked everybody, I said, I want all of you to stop for 2 seconds and think about the things that make you most proud in your life. What makes you proud? What do you feel good about? And I said, I'm not going to ask you to share with me what that is, but I can tell you what made that, whatever it was, make you feel good about yourself, make you proud of who you are. It's the thing you sacrificed for. It's the thing you worked hard to achieve. It's the thing you poured your blood, sweat, and toil into. That's what creates self-confidence. That's what creates independence in people. So my whole message is, yes, we have to get back to personal responsibility. We've got to help people lift them out of poverty. I do not believe in social programs that all they do is trap you in entitlement and dependence. As I said, what do we know from the world of psychology? This isn't me talking. Go to any psychology school. A dependent relationship is a destructive relationship for that person that's dependent. What do you want to raise as your children? You know the old axiom: a healthy, happy, well-adjusted, independent child. Why do we want to take huge chunks of our society and entrap them in dependence and entitlement?
But there will be people at times who simply can't afford insurance or can't afford to go to the doctor. And
Yeah.
it may not be their fault at all, and lost a job or something. What do you do with them?
I just got finished talking about premium support.
Okay.
Yeah, would you like to scale back Medicaid, Medicare, or disability, Social Security? Do you think that those... you said
all
as
those
we
programs,
move-
all those programs absolutely, positively need to be reformed. Look, bring it on, guys. Let's have this discussion. Because you know what? No politicians want to talk about it. And you know what? It's time for you guys to start taking it serious, because guess what? Let's deal with the reality. We have $16 trillion in debt. We've got 103% debt to our economy. We're borrowing 38 cents on the dollar. We're destroying the standard of living for most Americans. Their incomes have declined for the last 11 years, and yet the cost of all their goods. We're engaging in something called quantitative easing, which you and I have talked briefly about because you saw me at that. And for somebody who went to the University of Chicago, you probably took a class or two on this at some point. It is exactly what caused the destruction of Germany. I can walk you through country after country. The wealthiest country in Africa was Rhodesia. It is now Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe followed exactly that path. And you know what? I sometimes carry around with me a $100 trillion Zimbabwe note, which is worth about 50 cents. And if we don't change the course of entitlements, we will blow up our entire system. Greece, when they did their last restructuring, wiped out the pension value of the pension value of all their pension value by 50%. So every public employee, not only are they dealing with an unemployment rate of 22.8% and a youth unemployment rate, that's 25 years and younger, of 52%, but now all their pension account value got wiped out by 50%, and they're not even close to hitting the rock bottom. If we tip over in this point, it's gone. Social Security is going to be worthless because they'll money print and turn it to whatever that check that you won't even be able to buy lunch on.
Does reform then mean to trim the benefits for those?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Here's what I want to do with Social Security. Because again, I will tell you exactly what I will do.
Let me ask you this, on Social Security, I was with a fishing guide last week who said, I really resent the fact that people call Social Security an entitlement. I put money into that my entire life. So how could anyone call that an entitlement, and why would anyone pair that or take that away from you? He's a Republican.
I agree with his assessment that Social Security is unlike most of the other entitlements, because that man is exactly correct. He has put money aside. The problem that you have with the system is more people are taking money out of it than what put into it. But here's the fundamental, the bigger issue. And that is when Social Security was put in place back in the mid-30s, the retirement age was 65, life expectancy was 62. On average, people died 3 years earlier than they collected the check. That's truth. We're now in 2012. The retirement age is still 65, life expectancy is 79. So my view on Social Security is real simple. If you're 50 or older, we're not going to touch it. If you're under 50, you're going to add 2 years to retirement age. If you're under 40, you're going to add 2 more years, and if you're under 30, you're probably going to have to add another year. Secondly, which may be the other issue the Club for Growth is hitting me on, as I've said repeatedly, for those people like myself, and while it upsets a lot of people when I say this, and they'll say, I paid into the system my whole life, but for people like me who have been economically blessed in life and have been able to be fortunate, you're going to have to do some level of means testing. And that means somebody like me may not receive my Social Security payments.
The Hovde rule. I said that would become the Hovde rule.
Sure. Because you know what? If we don't, everybody's going to lose it. And everybody's going to have to pick choices to sacrifice.
Have you run the numbers on your proposal to raise the age, like you described, on a sliding scale? Would that do it? Would that
The problem is the problem. I don't have GAO at my disposal to run these numbers. Mm-hmm. But from what I've looked at, some of the other proposals been put out there that have talked about moving the retirement age to 68 and 69. You get almost there, but clearly with means testing the rest of it there, you can get there and make it solvent. Because we've known, look, we're in 2012. We've known for 30 years that this year was coming, and this is the critical year. Why? It's the year that the first age of the baby boom generation, those born in 46, turn 65. And the numbers just start cascading. It's, in fact, the single biggest issue that I'm appalled at Bill Clinton for. Because when they tried to deal with Social Security back in the 94 or 95 time frame, what did he do? The Republicans put out their proposal, and he clobbered them over it in the next election cycle. And since then, nobody has dealt with Social Security. And we've keep coming closer and closer and closer and closer and closer to 2012, knowing we're going to bankrupt the system. Look, guys, we all know this is another thing that I'm shocked that the press doesn't write about. Our government does not do accrual accounting, simple GAAP accounting. Every company has to do it. That is where you expense your future obligations, your liabilities. Our real deficits aren't $1.3 trillion last year, $1.3 trillion a year before, and $1.6 trillion the year before. They're probably $3.5 to $4.5 trillion because we're not expensing those liabilities. And there has been more studies done that have shown that by 2021, 2022, it overwhelms and crushes everything. But let's back up even before that. Let me just give some raw numbers. Last year, our interest payment on our debt was $454 billion. Second largest expenditure in our federal budget. Defense Department was $710 billion, the largest. And by the way, defense, not to say that we shouldn't still look at cuts, but defense is as a smaller percentage of spending as our percent of our GDP than it's been at any time since World War II, at any time. So it's not like we have a whole lot we can go there. I think defense spending as a percentage of GDP is down somewhere around 4 or something percent. But after defense at $710 billion, interest payments, just interest costs on our debt, is $454 last year. Now here's the conundrum. We are financing our debt at about 1.5%. The cheapest rate we financed our debt since the Great Depression. For every 1% increase in the financing costs of our federal government, that's another $160 billion. So if we go back to where we have been financing our debt for the last 20 years at 5.5%, you are going to take the interest payments, just the interest payments on our debt, over $1 trillion. It will overwhelm every single thing in our budget. It will crush everything out. And then you load on the entitlements and the facts we haven't done accrual accounting, we are bankrupt. Fundamentally bankrupt. And it's going to blow up every one of your lives too, because you know what? You guys are in an industry that's, not the strongest industry. And as the economy contracts, by the way, we're heading back into contraction. The estimates, we grew at 1.9% in the second quarter. It's one of the most anemic growth rates coming out of a recession we've ever seen. They've just revised third quarter numbers, depending on the investment bank, anywhere from 1 to 1.4%. We have an 8.2% unemployment rate, a 14.9% real unemployment rate. That's the U6 number by the Labor Department. And that factors in part-time labor looking for a full-time job, or those people have given up looking for labor.
Now, even a lot
job
of Democrats
altogether.
would argue that you're right about that the deficit cliff is out there, but that because of the economy's weakness, that we shouldn't be cutting back too much right now.
Where's their proposal to deal with any one of these issues? They say that every single time, and here we're blowing ourselves up. And then they say, oh, well, we won't be Greece, we won't be Spain. Our economy's so much bigger. It has nothing to do with the size. It just means the fall and the devastation is going to be more profound. That's all that means. Our debt as a percentage of our economy is higher than all but 4 European countries, and all 4 of them are in economic meltdowns. And by the way, they're having Germany helping bail them out to mitigate their falls. Do you think anybody can step in to try to mitigate the fall of the United States of America? Of course not.
Let me ask you a question about your own assets. Some voters might have a concern about you have a lot of investments, you've done very well, you're a wealthy guy. Do you intend to put those in a blind trust as Senator Cole has done? How will you handle those if you're elected?
I haven't figured that out at this point, because my difference than Senator Cole, some will clearly do that, but some, I don't know if I can. I haven't gotten that far because I have operating businesses. I have community banks. I don't even know. I haven't even gotten to that point in the cycle.
Would you continue to help operate those
No,
businesses?
God, no.
Yeah.
No. By no means. That would be, 1, a conflict of interest, and 2, I would not have the time. I don't have the time to deal with those businesses today. Fortunately, I have very good management teams in most of them.
Can I go back to two things you said? One, you mentioned that Washington has proved that it can't run anything. What about the military? Would you include that in there?
It is the one area where I think there is just a totally different culture with the military, and I think the military does a phenomenal job.
Second one, you were talking about personal responsibility. Diabetes too. The president's wife starts a campaign to get people to eat better, to get in better shape, and many people, members of your party, including Sensenbrenner, Congressman Sensenbrenner, mock her for this and say we should go on eating. If we want to eat French fries, we want to eat fattening foods. It doesn't make any difference. Don't tell us what to do.
I don't mock her for it at all. I applaud her. Anybody that's trying to encourage people to live a better lifestyle and eat healthier, I applaud. That partisan games is so silly. I mean, I have to tell you, gentlemen, and lady, I'm sorry. And I know you're going to laugh at this, but I knew it was bad. But the level of immaturity and pettiness and stupidity in the world of politics is stunning to me. In my world of business, if people behaved even close to what they behave like in politics, you would be shunned. Nobody would do business with you. I mean, I'm constantly amazed. And yeah, I take issue with a whole host of different things my party sometimes says. You know, saying ketchup is a vegetable. I mean, come on.
Can you name a couple others that you added to that list?
Well, I think you already addressed one of them. There are fractions of the Republican Party that are every bit much tied to cronyism and Wall Street reform. It's not just the Democrats, it's both sides of the aisle. In fact, you know, I talk about cronyism. It's my 8th point on my economic recovery plan. It is distorting our free market system and democracy itself. And you can go through example after example. I use the examples of Obamacare, how Nancy Pelosi's corporate givers are getting waivers from this. I use the example of Solyndra, how George Kaiser, who was one of President Obama's major campaign contributors, got a $500 million loan guarantee after he got elected. I use examples of like the Boeing tanker deal, where a cost-plus contract just goes on and on and on and on. In the world of real estate, a cost-plus contract works rather well. Why? Because if you don't deliver the building on time, on budget, guess what? You're getting fired. In the defense contracting world, guess what happens? These contracts go on and on and on and on and on and never seem to end, and the cost goes through the roof, and they just keep going on and on. Wall Street was a prime example of cronyism. A prime example of cronyism. So, you know, it's littered all over the place. Now, fortunately, I think we are getting, on the Republican side, a big brush and starting to sweep out some of those career politicians who have been very embedded in cronyism. And I know, without question, if I end up getting elected, that I will be in battles with people on the Republican side, without question.
How effective do you think you could be? I mean, if you're fighting everybody, how do you get anything done?
Look, I'm never going to take the approach, let's get in a fight. My first approach is, let me give you a hand and shake your hand, and let's talk about the real issues, and let me try to explain how serious this crisis is. Because guess what? What most career politicians don't understand, as this economy continues to weaken, that brush is just going to keep sweeping them out. Sweeping them out. Go back to Japan. Look at Japan over the last 22 years. They haven't even been able to keep a stable government at all during that 22 years. Why? People are frustrated. And they're going to continue to remain exceptionally frustrated and sweep politicians out until things get corrected. That's what's happened in Greece. How many governments have they toppled? They had to have, after having an election, they had to redo another election. And so they're already feeling the effects of it, and they're going to start feeling the effects of it much more. So my point to them is, you know, if you really want to continue your political career, you better start taking serious reforming the system and getting our economy stabilized, because guess what? When your next election's up, you'll probably be swept out as well.
Do you have any differences of disagreement with Senator Johnson?
I can't think of them. I applaud Ron. Ron is probably one of the only senators from a farm state that just voted against the Farm Bill. I think Ron is doing a fantastic job. And, you know, Ron's in a struggle with his own party half the time.
Dan, last question.
Sure.
I got so many, I gotta figure out which
How
one.
about a foreign policy one? I was hoping we'd get some foreign policy. I mean, geez, I love talking economic, guys. I really do, but I keep waiting to talk foreign policy.
Well, could you talk, first of all, could you explain, we were talking about with Lee's question about entitlement programs, and you got off on Social Security. So you support cutting the number of people on Medicaid and Medicare as well, right?
I believe in entitlement reform. Now, that may shrink the size, a pool of people that participate in it, and it will probably move them, particularly Medicaid, if we can move them through a premium support system where they're buying, if we can make some changes in the health insurance industry to drive down costs and move them.
I got another question.
Okay.
Keep on. Okay, so it might result in that. your voting record, you voted in Wisconsin for the first time in February in 25 years. I don't know if you did vote back then. And in Washington, D.C., you voted twice since 2004. Not very often. How do you convince people here that you're not a carpetbagger with a record like that?
Oh, come on, Dan. Let's get out of the pettiness. I mean, please.
Well, you're the one-
Dan, stop. I'm a third-generation Wisconsinite. I was born here. I was raised here. I graduated from East High. Went to the University of Wisconsin. I graduated from there. I've been back here nonstop. I've rebuilt the family real estate business. I mean, to sit there and even throw that term is ridiculous. And this is frankly, Dan, this is part of the problem. You're all playing gotcha when our country's burning to the ground. You want to talk about me being a carpetbagger? Please.
Well, look at your ad today, talking about others throwing mud, and then you end up throwing mud on top of them.
I've had 3 attack ads. Dan, you know it as well as I do. I have ran ad after ad after ad, radio ad, television ads. Not one of them has ever even mentioned any of my competitors' names. All of them have been on issues. All of them have been positive.
Today's mud is
Yes,
about the others.
because I've been taking nothing but attack ads. I've had Mark Newman up with 2 different attack ads. I've had Club for Growth in here with an attack ad. I've had Tommy at convention, Republican convention. I woke up in the morning, went to the door. Under the door of every single room was nothing but attack literature on me. Okay? Since the day I've gotten into this race, all I have had is those type of attacks. And you know what? I just rose above it. Stay on the issues. But at a certain point in time, you have to respond because otherwise people may think, well, is there something there? But wait, stop. You know this, Dan. You're not a political novice. So why are you asking the question? Because you're playing, let's play get you, gotcha. Again, our country's going down the tubes. Do you really want to play, are you a carpetbagger when you know my history? Are you really want to play these games?
This question, you only voted twice in D.C. from 2004. You vote in one presidential.
Dan,
you miss a lot of elections.
I'm a conservative in D.C. Do you understand that? Okay?
Yeah.
There is no chance at all. I'm a person that spent 75% of my life in an airplane, flying around the U.S., flying around the globe. You know a lot of what I've been up to. I built homeless shelters for street kids in, Kigali, Rwanda, Mombasa, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, Mexico City, Huanaco, Peru. So when it comes to a vote in Washington, D.C., and you're a conservative and your only choice is a liberal Democrat and a liberal Democrat, it's a little discouraging. Do we have other questions? Let's bring on some foreign policy ones.
Well, we'll ask you one foreign policy question, and then we'll have to wrap up. Let's talk about the Eurozone crisis, which has its roots in some of your own background. Do you think that the U.S. should be doing anything that it's not doing now to help resolve the problem in Europe, since we have such a huge stake there?
No. There's no way. Look,
is there anything we can do?
We've already opened massive euro-dollar swap lines from the Federal Reserve to the ECB so they can have the liquidity. But the reality of it is Europe will sink. There is no way, and this whole phoniness that Germany is somehow going to save the day. Germany's 31% of the EU economy. 31% can't save that much of the economy that's collapsing. And by the way, Germany's economy, it's not like it has robust growth. You also have a country like Finland, which went through a significant collapse, and they look at it and say, the Greeks, the Spaniards, the Italians aren't willing to do the necessary things that we did and the economic crisis that we suffered through. Why are we going to continue to extend them lines? It is a European problem. They have to solve it.
And do you think the Eurozone is going to break apart over this?
I think there's no question the Eurozone will break apart. It will probably last for another 3-4 years now. How that devolves, I'm not quite sure. You could have Finland and Netherlands leave because Finland and every one of the bailout packages are wanting cash collateral placed in their banks, which really isn't a bailout. You still have issues with the Constitutional Court in Germany that will allow the bailout to occur. The German populace may not be kind to it. In the countries that are suffering, be it Greece or Spain, as the strain gets deeper and deeper, you may just have them say enough is enough. We'll move to the lira or the real or whatever and depart. Even though that will be devastating, at least it will cause an economic system where they can eventually get out of it at some point in time. So sadly, I don't think there is really any way to.
So it sounds like you think they're willing to be multiple currencies.
Oh, I think you're going to definitely head back to multiple currencies.
That's the only way these countries
Yeah.
can get out from under.
Now, there still may be a euro. It could be a euro. It could be a euro of all the broken countries, and then they'll just get into hyperinflation to try to deal with it. Or it could be a euro of the strong countries where the other countries move back to
Some
the base
people
currencies.
have suggested that the ECB ought to be doing more, that they ought to have been more aggressive to lower rates, maybe do more of the kinds of things that the U.S. Fed has done.
I think
you wouldn't.
I think it's fallacy at its. The one thing in Washington is there's or in any political capital is always this hubris that they can control everything. So there's laws of economics that are every bit as strong as laws of physics that you just simply can't get around, and they have so mismanaged their economies and they've pushed their debt limits to such high levels. Dan knows this because he heard me speak at the Milwaukee Press Club. The most comprehensive study of government defaults and government debasements has been done in the last few years. It's probably one of the most important economic books ever written by Carmen Reinhart, Kenneth Rogonoff, two of the most esteemed economists. It's called This Time is Different, 8 Centuries of Financial Folly. They document in detail every country everywhere around the world that has gone into default or gone into debasement, because you're left with one of two options. And their summary is once you get your economy, your debt in your economy over 90%, it stays that way for more than 3 years, you're left with one of two outcomes. One is a default, which is devastating, or hyperinflation. You debase your currency, you run the printing press, and you just drive down the value of your currency and destroy the living standards of all Americans.
Do you expect to continue to finance your campaign largely with your own funds through the rest of the campaign?
Through the rest of the primary, or?
Well, the primary and then in the general.
No, I'm out there trying to raise money.
But I mean, most of the money has come from yourself so far. So
Yeah, yeah.
Do you expect that trend to continue?
What's interesting, we're getting more and more checks coming in as the campaign's building, and, depending on the poll, potentially being in the lead, and my guess is I am in the lead given all the attacks that have been coming at me. So, I certainly hope to raise money and contributions. I'm working hard at that.
You're a smart businessman. I assume you figured out the maximum amount you would put into the campaign. What would that figure be?
I would never share that with you.
Just between us.
I would never share that with you. You're all nice guys, but I would never share that with you.
The number
Come on, where's a foreign policy question?
We just had one.
No, but we've got a lot of big issues going around on the globe.
What do you do in Afghanistan?
I've said, get out. Absolutely, get out. We don't have the treasury to deal with it. I think the risk of our young men and women's lives, it's amazing how people do not read history books. Afghanistan has been tried to be occupied so many times. The Russians, the British, the Ottomans, you can go on. And eventually they give up because they say, what is the importance of that parcel of territory and trying to, rule that group of people, which don't want us there. Now, I'm in support of the fact that we went there. Obviously, that is where the terrorist camps came out of September 11th. But as I've always said, we can either use a base from a neighboring country or just leave a base within the country, pull our troops in, stop trying to remake their society. They don't want us there, fundamentally. We're not going to change unless we want to double down and stay there for another 50, 100 years. We're not going to remake the society in the way that we want it because they don't want our form of government, our form of society. And we have to be realistic about these things.
What's Iraq going to say?
What?
Was Iraq a mistake?
I don't have the intelligence to determine that. And I'm always, leery of opining strongly on things where I don't have the intelligence. Look at President Obama. He attacked President Bush ruthlessly on a number of these issues. And yet, once he's been in office, he hasn't shut down Guantanamo. He left us in Iraq a lot longer. We're not out of Afghanistan. I mean, you could go through issue after issue. So, I don't try to Monday morning quarterback when I don't have intelligence data. Now, in saying that, do I think there was mistakes that were made along the way? Absolutely. But fundamentally, what we also have to appreciate, and this happens with with Syria, with Iraq, all throughout the Middle East. And it's, again, amazing that politicians won't pick up a book and learn and understand these things. I've learned a lot of it just by traveling. I've been in 71 countries in my life. I've operated around the globe. The fundamental problem that we're having in so many of these countries is underlying religious war between the Sunni and the Shia. And that dates all the way back to Muhammad, when his nephew versus his three counselors at Muhammad's death. And the nephew, it's the strain of the Shia. And the Sunni strain came from his advisors, his close confidants. And you go look at Syria today. It is one of the few countries where the Shia are in control, where the majority is the Sunni. In fact, it's a very small sect of Shia called the Alawites. So you have an underlying religious war. That's what was happening in Iraq, where it was the Sunni, on the other hand, ruling the country, the Ba'athist Party, and the Shia were the majority
So
of
what
it.
do you think of the Obama administration's policy towards Syria up to now?
Again, I am sympathetic to getting too deeply involved in any conflict, because I don't believe you put our young men and women at risk until you have a clear outcome that there is a way to resolve it and extract ourselves out of it. I would not be in there. However, I would be providing bigger support through a country like Turkey that understands it's an ally of ours, it's a neighbor of Syria, and letting them help flow goods to the rebels, because, let's face it, they're in a civil war, and it's going to be an ugly civil war. And I don't want our troops in the middle of it. And that was the one problem that happened in Iraq. We were in the middle of a civil war.
And what about, you keep coming back to the economy, and the money we spent in Iraq, and the
Absolutely.
money we spent on the wars.
Absolutely.
If you'd been in the Senate, would you have done something different to try and raise money for these wars?
Well,
Or
I just
not.
got finished saying that I don't think we have the money to be in Afghanistan, and I don't want to risk our young people's lives, so I would have been out of there some time ago. I didn't have the intelligence data whether we needed to go into Iraq, but I sure wasn't in favor of us, the protracted battle and putting our soldiers in the middle of a civil war
Well,
that was happening.
What about the idea of how we paid for it or didn't pay for it? In other words, it was sort of off the books, the Iraq War, wasn't it?
I think it's wrong. I think it's fundamentally wrong.
Okay.
Nothing should be off the books. It's just like I got finished talking about with entitlements. They're all off they're not technically off the books, but it's not proper accounting. You're not expensing your liabilities.
All right, Captain, thanks for being with us.
Oh, thank you.
Appreciate it.
I've enjoyed it.